So hello everyone, welcome to the BSME Newsletter Masterclass. I'm Maria Pieri, the Editorial Director of National Geographic Traveller and the BSME Head of Education. And I'm joined by the lovely Farrah Storr, Head of Writer Partnerships with Substack UK and Editor of Substack's Reads. For those of you unaware of what a superstar Farrah is, then here goes a quick intro. As she says herself, in another life, she was the former award-winning editor of ELLE, Cosmo and Women's Health. She's been named one of the most influential BAME leaders in the UK and sits on the board of the National Theatre. After a 23-year career in magazines, which I don't really know how you manage that because you still look so young and fresh-faced, Farrah left at the end of 2021 to launch Substack in the UK. She's also launched her own Substack newsletter, Things Worth Knowing. So let's kick it off. Welcome, Farrah. Thank you for joining us today.
Nice to be back.
Yeah, it feels like you literally just left, but I suppose it's been quite a while for you now. You've set up Substack in the UK, and I was kind of thinking we could kick it off by just saying, if you were to explain to people that are maybe quite new to it, what exactly is Substack? Just in a couple of sentences, just to kick off with.
Of course. So Substack, what most people will know is they will think that it's a newsletter platform, and in its sort of simplest sense it is. But actually, the best way to think about Substack is it's a personal media channel for the individual. So that's probably the most succinct way of describing what it is.
Okay, personal media channel for the individual. Okay, so how did you find the transition from going to magazines to Substack? How did you find that first moving across? And it's been, how long has it been now? A couple of years?
No, not even. I started a Substack at the beginning of December, so it's only been a few months actually. It feels like a couple of years.
You've done a lot in that time.
We did a lot in that time. But you know what? The transition has actually, even though it's going from traditional media into tech, Substack really is a journalistic platform. You know, it is full of writers, and you know, so in that sense, my job is head of writer partnerships, which is to say, I look after all of the UK, so anything to do with the UK market. So a big part of my job is getting writers on the platform, helping them become a success on the platform, explaining what the platform is. So there's lots of crossover there, and in fact, actually, I would say the best part of being a magazine editor used to be helping writers, which really is I would say about 90% of my job right now. So it's actually very similar, apart from it gets the best bits that I loved about magazines, which in the end, you know, I didn't get to do so much of. So in answer to your question, it's been pretty okay. It's been fine.
And why was it important for you to move to this role? Was it that you've sort of touched on it there? It's the fact that you're almost finding that you're working better with writers now, closer with writers.
Yeah, I think there were lots of reasons actually why I left, and ideologically, I suppose. You know, one of the things whenever I was an editor, and I was forever like doing competitions and scholarships and trying to get people into journalism, and the truth was behind the scenes, it was really hard because I always felt that I was trying to get, you know, I'd go and give these talks to students going, come into magazines, it's amazing. And of course, I was always aware that actually, whether we liked it or not, the industry was shrinking. And it was going to be really hard for people, harder in some ways than it was for me to get started. And I knew that word rates were going down, and it was very, very difficult to sort of to tell that story. So, and then the other thing, of course, is I always had, and this was probably with my social, because I used to sit on the board of the Social Mobility Commission. So I always had this feeling that actually to make it in magazines, it was a shame that you really had to come down to London to make it in mags. And I always felt really, I thought that was quite tricky. And so in the summer of last year, I think it was, I had sort of all of these sort of thoughts and feelings, and I still loved magazines, by the way. But I looked at what I was reading, and I realised actually that I was spending more money on Substack subscriptions. So I was subscribed to lots of different writers than I was on magazines. And then when I looked into Substack as a sort of company, I was like, well, actually, the model is so interesting because what it is, it's the individual who can write from anywhere. There is no ad model connected with Substack. So if you, Maria, were to start a newsletter, you can charge for it or you can give it away for free. but you're getting paid directly from your consumer. And it just felt like ideologically it fitted with what I believed independent writing should be. And then I just sort of felt like it was a different, it's not instead of magazines. I think the things work side by side, but it was a different way, basically, of getting the masses involved in writing. And I've always thought, maybe rightly or wrongly, that there's a writer within most people. And it just felt like what Substack would allow me to do is to sort of help unlock that in everyone.
So following on from that, how do you feel the UK has sort of like come in and almost seen Substack? What do they think of Substack so far, and what's their perception of it? And how are you finding that you're able to connect with editors and say to them, yes, use this platform, I think it's really great?
Well, you know what? I'm actually not dealing with editors that much. I'm dealing with a lot of young writers. I'm dealing with a lot of freelancers. Dealing with a lot of journalists I used to commission. So actually, and I do think there is an opportunity for editors to think about a Substack, but I'm actually dealing with those people who are maybe slightly down the pecking order in a way. So features editors, commissioning editors. Of course, in the early days of Substack in the UK, what most people thought of was Dominic Cummings, because Dominic Cummings is probably one of, in the UK, the more well-known Substacks. All those stories about Dominic Cummings in the press, they all come from his Substack. Or Salman Rushdie has a Substack and he releases his novel on it. So in the very early days, a lot of people were like, well, what is this thing? Is it just for big writers? Is it right-wing? Like, what is it? So there was definitely an education piece of going, actually, it is, there are a vast array of writers on here. There are comic book writers, there are novelists, there are Booker Prize winners, there are young journalists. But I think the other big change that's happened since I joined, when I started in December, Substack was very much a newsletter platform, which is to say it was about writing. So it's basically writing a column. Mm-hmm. But in the last few months, what we found is a lot of writers going, actually, I don't want to just write a newsletter. I want to host my podcast. I want to have video. I want to do voice memos to my community. I want to ask them questions, because the difference with a Substack, as opposed to, say, a traditional newsletter like a MailChimp, like on a MailChimp, you put it out to the world. But the difference with Substack is you put your column out to the world, but the world answers back, i.e., they get to comment on what you've said. So what you end up with is essentially building very strong communities. And the other thing I should point out, which again, when I'm talking to writers, is a really interesting thing for writers to get their head around. The charging thing, people are like, well, why would people pay for my work? And I always go, you would be amazed, actually, at how much people would pay and how many people will pay. But the other thing, which I think is really important for writers, is that so many of us, and I did this myself, we give away all this free content on our Instagram, on our Twitter, on our Facebook. Like, we've got all these different platforms that we use. And of course, the minute that we leave those platforms, if I left Twitter tomorrow, I lose that entire community that I spent years building up for free. But on Substack, you own the community. They give you their email. And even if you leave Substack tomorrow, you still own that relationship. You own the emails, you own your audience. So this is a very long monologue, but I suppose the most important thing is to writers and editors is own your bloody community. Like, make sure you own them and that the platform doesn't own them.
So in some respects, the way that you're describing it is, I'm not as familiar with Substack as I should be, apart from the research I've been doing here. It's almost like bringing together the social media kind of elements, as well as video, as well as Facebook, as well as YouTube, but owning it on your own Substack, but also then being able to connect with them by writing your own newsletter effectively, or communication piece in this way.
Yeah, you're right. So essentially you're bringing in, you're sort of scraping all the communities from the different social media platforms you spent years building. You're putting them in one place, and you're serving them in one place, your video, your podcast, your column, and you're also allowing them, there's sort of a breakdown between performer and audience. You're allowing that sort of relationship to be much closer than it ever was. So yes, you are right. Elements of journalism, but sort of elements of social media in a way.
bringing some of it in as well. So if somebody wanted to start up on something like on Substack, if they wanted to start up, what's the basics that they should be doing? How should they be looking at it? If it is a writer, it almost sounds like it might be a bit easier, but could editors also use it as well for magazines? I'm just trying to think how that might work.
So editors could, in fact, I won't say her name, but we have somebody who had an online magazine and is just, I think she's doing it today or tomorrow, is moving that over to Substack. And the reasons why a lot of people who have magazines are doing that is because they want the community aspect. And also, we don't really serve ads on Substack. We just sort of don't believe in ads. And, we sort of think it's a bad thing for algorithms and the way journalists write. So you have a lot of people who are not particularly are doing really great content. They're not particularly doing well on the ad front. They're not able to reach they know they've got all these readers, but they don't, because they see them on Instagram or they might be commenting on Twitter on what the magazine is doing online. But it's all a bit disbanded. And so what this individual is doing is going, well, actually, I really rate the content I do. So actually, I would much prefer, rather than sort of scrabbling around for ad money, I would much rather have my consumers pay me directly for the content I do. I'd much rather have those consumers comment in one place. And then also, I'd much rather serve those consumers directly, because if you write a Substack, it goes directly into their inbox rather than relying on them every day to go to the website and check out what's happening. So if you edit a magazine, that's the way to look at it. It becomes this very tight ecosphere where you don't have to rely on ads. And of course, we know relying on ads is tricky, right? Because we end up writing certain things because they'll get so many eyeballs. So you absolutely can if you're an editor. But then the other thing to think about is individuals do very well. So, if you are a magazine, you can absolutely serve content to people through your Substack. But if
they're asking your columnist to create a Substack.
That's exactly right. Or you as the editor would be the voice. It's like the editor's letter goes out, basically. But yeah, so generally at the minute, it's largely for individuals and it's largely for writers. But that's not to say that magazine editors cannot do it, because it's happening.
Okay. And in terms of actually monetizing it, you touched on it, that it doesn't have ads. How would you monetize a newsletter? For Substack, but just generally ideas for that, because it is still very much a kind of ad-led or sponsorship model for many people when they're looking at their newsletter.
Yeah, it's the scariest one of all, which is you ask your readers to pay for the content that you do, which of course a lot of writers unfortunately think people won't pay for the work that they do. So when you start a Substack, what we suggest is, so you'll write a column or you'll write a newsletter, your Substack. And then you ask people to subscribe. You go, if you would like to get this newsletter into your inbox, become a subscriber. And there are two types of subscribers you will end up having. One is you will get free subscribers who don't pay any money, but they get the newsletter into their inbox, or they read it on the app every day or however many times you write it. But then you also will get people who will pay. And how it works is this is the best way to think about it. It's slightly cheesy, but there is this analogy, which is if you're putting on a music festival, put your best act on stage for free, so it brings the biggest crowd. So in other words, your best column or your best newsletter, always keep that free. So on my newsletter, the column I write, which takes me the longest amount of time, it will forever be free. I will never charge for that. And I also feel it's the right thing to do. But what it does is it brings the biggest crowd to the stage. Once you have that massive free audience there, you sort of dangle a backstage pass at them and go, if you become a paid subscriber, you can get access to, and people do lots of different things. So in my case, if you are a free subscriber, you get my columns. I also do writing courses. They are free. The written writing courses are free. But if you become a paid subscriber, I do like a monthly course with me on Zoom. You get access to that. So I think Dominic Cummings, certainly in the beginning, his columns or his sort of 20,000 word pieces were free, but he didn't ask me anything on a Saturday night where you could ask him literally anything. You had to be a paying subscriber. So writers are thinking about, well, what could that backstage pass look like? And the interesting thing is, we've had a lot of people who have moved over from Patreon, and Patreon is interesting because if you have super fans, which a lot of writers do, you can go to Patreon and pay for their stuff, but it's sort of a locked gate really, which, and you can only unlock the gate if you pay. On Substack, what we find, and I found this in my own newsletter, is that you sort of get this freewheeling action, which is all the free subscribers in time start to move into paid subscribers. One, because they see the backstage pass, but also, Maria, because a lot of people sort of feel this person's working really hard. They're doing all this stuff for free. They sort of feel like they're on your side. So there is an more response. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
All right, that's great. I'm going to ask some quick fire questions just so that we cover some of the stuff about basic newsletter things that people tend to ask. And in terms of people listening, please feel free to use the chat to ask some questions, and I'll make sure that I can try and put them across as we get to the Q&A nearer the end. So in terms, you touched on it there, how often are you sending out newsletters, and how, especially for one person who's doing the writing, how often are you able to write that column that's taken you all that time? And from my curiosity, who's editing it? Who's proofreading it for you? Because that's part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, so the honest answer to that is you have to proofread it yourself. You have to make, and you know what? It really forces writers to be at the top of their game, because if you start putting out sloppy stuff, you start to see the subscribers depleting. So, and you know what, towards the end of my days in magazines, writers were expected to do a lot of their own. To be honest, it wasn't like in the days when I started where you just handed it over to a poor sub-editor and went fix that. So it's very much on you. The reality is the people who we see do best are publishing a minimum of twice a week. But it doesn't mean you have to write 2 columns a week. The heartbeat will always be the newsletter. So you could do, for me, for example, I do 1 newsletter a week. It's about 1,500 words. It goes out on a Sunday. But I do something in the rest of the week. And often what I do is you can do a voice memo. So you can literally just record a voice message and go, hi, it's Wednesday. I don't know, I've just been in the garden and I wanted to share with you some thoughts on gardening. That's obviously a terrible example. Or you can, for your second thing, you could just ask them a question. We call it a thread, where you literally just write in a question and go, hi guys, it's Wednesday. Just wondering how you're all feeling today. You press publish, it goes out as an email to everyone, and then your community just start writing back to you. So as long as there's a rhythm of sort of a minimum of 2 things a week, that seems to be what's best. Some people do it every single day. A lot of people.
Do you think there's a maximum as well?
There can be, but the people, the biggest stars on Substack are the ones, and there are a lot of them who it's now their full-time job. I mean, there are a huge number of journalists. It is full-time now. And they're doing it sort of 4 to 5 times a week. And I think if the expectation from the beginning is there, which is this is a weekly newsletter, you'll be getting something actually every week, then people are okay. When it doesn't work is when it's sporadic and you can tell the writer is just 1 week it's 4 times, once it's once. They like to have a rhythm. So the more you can do
it once a week, build it up to twice a week, then build it up to 3. Yeah. And would you say there's a good time of day to send them out, or do you think that just depends on the content and the type of newsletter it is?
I think it depends. And ultimately, you will know your own community, because whoever subscribes to your Substack are your audience. So you're going to know better. In my case, I know it's largely women. They're 30 plus. They've probably got kids. So I do mine on a Sunday afternoon. But most people, there isn't sort of a perfect time, because there's so many Substacks now. You sort of have to take a hunch on that yourself. But if you're doing something lifestyle-y, say, like I do, I'd say anything from Thursday onwards, really, Thursday to Sunday.
And in terms of how the newsletter is comprised, there's lots of different types of way of putting together a newsletter. Would you recommend headlines or amount of text, or would you put the whole column on there? what have you found, or what would you recommend in terms of how to engage with readers best when they're viewing that newsletter?
I think this is where journalists and editors have the advantage, because we launched the app last month, and so if you choose to read newsletters that you subscribe to in the app rather than on an email, you want a sort of short, punchy sort of headline, and you want a short, punchy sell. So I would say, I mean, that's not to say longer ones don't work, but these newsletters, these Substacks, they're relying on what journalists know already, which is make it punchy, make it intriguing. So yeah, just sort of, the crowd that we're talking to today, these are editors. You will instinctively know what to do.
Yeah,
keep it short and punchy.
I was going to say, are there any favourites that you could just let us know? Who do you like following, for example, or who do you like subscribe to? You think, that these would be good people for people to follow or to read newsletters. Who's doing it well, apart from yourself, of course?
I'm not sure I'm doing it that well, to be honest with you. Well, look, an amazing one, is George Saunders, who is basically teaching people how to write. So if you subscribe to George Saunders, and it's all free, he doesn't even charge. If you subscribe to him, he basically, you're getting one of the world's best short storytellers to teach you how to write creatively. That is an amazing Substack. In the UK, the author Tim Lott does a really similar thing. I think it's called Tim Lott's Writing Bootcamp. Also really great. Majority of it is free. Mark Bittman, so he's a big sort of New York Times food writer. He has his Substack actually is interesting because it's not just him. He will write and he'll do some podcasts and video, but it's called the Bittman Project. His is more like a magazine in that he has contributors who will write. So that's a really good one to look at. Esther Corrin does a really funny one called The Spike. That's a really good British one. There's one that I particularly love, which is by a Chelsea, only because I'm mad about gardening. She's like a award-winning Chelsea gold medal winning garden designer. She's called Jo Thompson. And she does one called The Gardening Mind. And basically, she'll write these columns about gardening, but a lot of what she does is she is obsessed with talking to her community. And some people are not so keen on that, and some of them are obsessed, and Jo is obsessed. So suddenly you get access to somebody you have never been able to get access to. And you have people, myself included, going, Jo, can you basically help me design my garden? And she's sending you it's quite amazing. So that would definitely be my tip. That's probably my favorite.
Okay, fantastic. So I've got a question which actually feeds into what we're talking about. Any child-centric ones that I can see on the Q&A that somebody's asked? Any child-centric Substacks that you think, or newsletters that you follow that you'd be interested in sort of promoting or suggesting people look at?
Child-centric ones.
Child-centered or child-friendly Substacks. I should be looking at it as a kids magazine. We're very interested in the ad-free nature of the platform. That's a question from Freya Hardy.
Do you know what? I don't know the answer to that question. I thought Freya meant as in ones which are geared towards parenting, of which there are a lot, of which Lorraine Candy does a very good one, the ex-editor of the Sunday Times Style. But I think Freya must mean ones which are for kids. And I don't know the answer. And the fact that I don't know the answer would suggest that there is probably, this is a young platform. That would suggest that there is probably an opportunity there for somebody to do that. I mean, comic books are massive. There's a lot of people doing comics, but it's adult comics. And illustrations, we have a lot of people. There's an illustrator for the New Yorker. They have a very successful one. But in terms of ones for kids, I don't know. There may well be, but not one that I'm aware of.
Could be something that somebody goes into. Good opportunity, absolutely. And in terms of open rates and stuff, what would you consider as good open rate? Do people sort of judge things like that? I mean, for us, for example, when we do newsletters, or maybe I shouldn't say this, I don't know, but obviously we're trying to get a 30% plus, and if we can as a good open rate. What would you suggest for Substack or for other newsletters? What's a good open rate?
Substack open rates are really high, really high. So the average is 40%, like that, and that's an average. Most people's, the ones, certainly the writers that I look at, they're sort of getting 60 plus. So they're super high. And, you know, I personally think a lot of it, you know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but just my own observations are the incentive to open them is that you get to have your own say. It's not like you're just opening and sitting passively reading it. You're opening it and then you get to talk back to the writer. So I think that is why our open rates they're unusually high. They're very, very high. And everybody that comes over, because we have lots of people who are moving from MailChimp, they're coming to Substack, have always noted that actually they're quite surprised at how high the open rates are.
How would you find managing that kind of community though? Because I suppose there's a certain element where it would get so large you might not be able to respond to everyone. If you're the writer and you're putting it out there and you're the personality, I mean, I can perhaps if you had a database or subscription database of about 1,000, you could probably cope. But I mean, if it got into the 10s and 20s and 30s, yeah.
What you're totally right. What you tend to find is the communities on Substack. Sounds terrible. Of course, they want interaction with the author, but actually what starts to happen is they become very much like a very nuanced and interesting Reddit thread. They're talking to one another. They're actually not there always for you. They like to be in your space, in your curated space, because they're sort of your people, but actually they're there for one another. And so because of that, what some people are doing, I wouldn't recommend it early on if you start a Substack, but some people lock the community after a while. They go, actually, if you become a paid subscriber, you can join the conversation. If you're not a paid subscriber, you can read the piece, but you can't comment, because there's value, of course, in that community conversation.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just the other trend that I've sort of seen with some research is that some people are now going back into, like, they say in the US, for example, you've got some people that went off and did a Substack and did their own newsletter, but now they're coming back to the papers and the papers are almost buying them back in again. Why do you think that is, and is that likely to be a trend? Are people finding it unmanageable to be able to do their own newsletters and actually they can't monetize them, or what else would you suggest is happening here?
Well, I think first of all, for that, my experience is there was one person or two people who famously did that, and everybody thinks everybody's done that. They joined Substack, and those are only people who gave up their full-time jobs to do Substack full-time. I think it was a guy from the Atlantic. I think that's him. But, he really is a minority. Most people, what they do is they have their Substack on the side. I mean, that's the reality. And they build it and they build it. And then at some point it reaches sort of this momentum where they go, I'm probably earning enough now, because remember, you're charging between about £5 and £7 a month, and that's annually recurring revenue. So you only need about 400, 500 paid subscribers to be making a significant income. So most people don't suddenly go, right, I'm going to leave the Atlantic and I'm going to go and do my Substack full time. Most people will have a job, and on the side, they will be nurturing and watering their Substack. And then as it grows, they then make the decision and go, well, actually, I have this annually recurring revenue now. Now is probably the time for me to go independent. So most people do it that way. With that individual, I mean, I don't know, but I suspect, I don't know the full story, but I suspect he was paid handsomely at the Atlantic, made the move, and it didn't quite work out as quickly, perhaps, as he'd have thought. And so he went back. And I understand that as well.
So say like, if I put a scenario, if somebody was writing and they had their own Substack or newsletter, what kind of revenue would you expect to be able to create, say, from 1,000 subscribers? I mean, I'm just trying to get an idea of how you monetize it and how you actually get money out of this, if this is the way forward for newsletters.
Yeah, so the conversion is, so this is why the frees are so important. So when you start your Substack, and I always say this to people when I'm talking to writers, you have a thing called the About page where you basically explain who you are. And I always say to people, only spend a very small amount of time saying, hi, I'm Farrah, I'm an editor, blah, blah, blah. The most important thing that you do is you sort of write a manifesto, which is why on Substack, what is happening in the world that you feel that you should be here writing independently. What happens very quickly is a lot of people will just go, I believe in that person. I want to show my support. So first of all, you'll get this wave of people who will just pay you because they believe in what you're doing. So that's your first lot of paid people. The second lot of paid people will start as free subscribers. They'll see the backstage pass and go, I want in. So that will happen. But the most important strategy I always say to people is concentrate in the very early months on building your frees. Don't even worry about the paid, because the conversion rate usually is about 5 to 10%. So if you have 10,000 frees, you're going to get anything between 500 and 1,000 of those paying you. And when you think about that, when you do the maths on that, that's a significant income.
What's an average price that somebody would pay?
Well, you can do anything, but we would advise between in America, it's between $5 and $7. But
service then, yeah.
Yeah, it's less than 2 cups of coffee for all this content in a month.
That's true. When you put it like that, yes.
Yeah, it's cheap.
Jamie has asked a question, which actually was the one I was thinking to ask next. So what have you learned from Substack that you would then ask, think editors can then apply to their own publications, newsletters?
Well, I think from what I've seen, certainly when I was doing newsletters, and this is probably very different to what other editors are doing, but newsletters that I used to work on, we never gave it enough time. It was always stuff we already had lying around. We were like, right, let's sort of do a little bit of, jiggery pokery with it, and then let's make it into a newsletter. So essentially we were serving the same content in many ways, but it was sort of redressed, and it would always be like 10 stories, and in there we would put affiliate links and blah, blah, blah. It was not a good reading experience for people, I would say. What I've learned from Substack is get your best writers. I mean, that's the main thing, and that's the most important thing. I think sometimes people forget, sometimes people can treat writers like dairy cows, which is you can replace one for the other. You cannot. Writers are the most important thing that we have in journalism. So think about your most important writer. Who is the person that really engages with your audience, and get them to write the newsletter. And it only needs to be one thing. I think these days of let's give people maximum content, maximum value with 10 stories on a newsletter, I would say don't do that. Give them one thing and make it brilliant and make it the best read that they're going to read all week. So for National Geographic, again, I don't know, but, it might be that there's this lake which, has now completely disappeared, and you'd want the story on that. And that's it. That's sort of job done. So that's what I would suggest, concentrate on the reader. It's the thing about newsletters is it is such a direct experience. You are landing in their inbox. For God's sake, give them something to look to look forward to. Don't give them a bunch of things to buy and shop and.
Okay, so I mean listening to that from my perspective, I would be like, okay, so we could try that for one and then carry on with, say, the 10 headline approach for another, then have a subs one for another one, and then would that still be something you would consider or recommend? Because I'm just trying to think how it's quite a big leap to then go to just one story. Not that I think it's incorrect, it's just trying to work out how from our perspective, from the magazine world, would we do that?
You mean, so you currently do, so do you do sort of 10, your newsletter?
So for example, at the moment, we currently do, just from our perspective, we do, on a Tuesday, we'll have an editorial-led newsletter, which would be about 10 stories, but usually around a theme, or it might be the new issue launch. On the Thursday, we do a marketing newsletter, and on the Sunday, we might do a theme-based newsletter, for example, Easter or Week Easter, or bookshop cafes or something like that. So it would be theme-based. So
personally, I mean, this is just my feeling. And of course, you have to remember it's different because Substack is for independent writers. But from what I've seen, if I was redoing newsletters again, if I was back on a magazine, I wouldn't overload people. I would really value the relationship of landing in their inbox. So I personally wouldn't be doing any marketing. I would be going, these people are busy. They come to you because they want to feel intellectually nourished. Let's give them the best of the best. What is the best stuff that we have? Because not everyone's going to see it on our website. Not everyone's going to see it in our magazine. Give them the very best thing and deliver it to them, even if it's once or twice a week, and leave it at that. That's what I would personally do, because people are so busy and content is still flying around everywhere. I just think cut down the number of things that you're sending out to them. Give them your best only, so that every time they see National Geographic or, Esquire, they go, that's the one sort of intellectually nourishing thing that's going to make my life better this week. So that's what I would advise.
And how would you then work I'm just thinking again from a magazine perspective, work with your writers or freelance writers or columnists, the most popular ones, for example, as you've suggested, to then ensure that how could that work with the magazine so that they could then also do theirs, but it's almost kind of leading back to us as well? Just trying to work out how that...
Well, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because actually columnists, this is where it's a tricky one for editors, because actually your columnists are your source of gold. And of course, if a columnist becomes, and this is the tricky thing, becomes bigger than the brand, then the columnist is going to go, sod this, I'm going to do my own Substack because I'm
obviously in the US.
Which is what happens. Yeah. So if I was editing now, perhaps you don't make it the columnist. Maybe you go, what's the best feature that we've got? What's the feature that everybody should be reading? And you do it as that. And you could do it, Maria, from the editor. The note from the editor is your personal take on this story. Why is this story important? Why do you think it's worth 20 minutes of someone's time? You've picked this particularly for them, and then you just put the story, but it would have to be the best of the best. And that way you'd have different voices, which would represent the breadth of your magazine, of course.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm just trying to think about how it works for our community, especially for this particular BSME chat. We've also got a question from Greta. She said, for those who want to start a Substack, do you recommend batch writing content in advance or writing pieces week by week? Or do you think that comes down to personal preference and organisational style?
Yeah, I think that's it does come down to organisational style. But what I would say is I've had so many writers, myself included, who wrote a backlog of stuff. And then, so I wrote about 6 features before I started. I put my first one up and I realised suddenly everything I'd written was wrong. And actually, the best thing, so your audience are going to react in a way that you might not be able to predict. So when I wrote my piece, I realised that on Substack, your audience will start to give you a lot of personal detail about themselves in a way that on magazines and websites, I never knew. I could tell you most of my readers, their age, where they are, if they've got a dog, if they're married. I think because they give you their email, they end up in this sort of very intimate sort of Reddit space. And so when you read the comments, you realise all the stuff you thought they might like is actually wrong. So I personally, if you have the time, I think you do it 1 week at a time, and then your reader in a way guides you. Yeah, the feedback guides what you end up doing.
Yeah, and I have got one of the questions here saying what do you find best, broad versus deep, the best topics for engagement? But I think that really, looking at that question, it's really very much based on what you find best. So maybe perhaps for 2 or 3, what have you found that's really works for you in terms of engagement? What's been one of your best kind of
with our newsletter? I can tell you very clearly, and it's not surprising because the people that have come to my newsletter are people that were following me on my social media channels. So the one that I wrote about walking away from motherhood, that's by a long way the most popular. I wrote one this week about what happens when you don't have any opinion. That's done really well. And then my other one was about my relationship with my husband. So for me, but again, it's because I kind of know my audience. They're resonating with the deeply personal. And look, things worth knowing. The sort of the notice on the tin is, I'm going to talk to you about stuff that I could never publish in magazines, the stuff which, never really fitted a franchise or a formula, or maybe is a bit sort of too dark. So for me, those are what does the best. But that's because I understand my audience. That's what they want. If I serve them beauty tips, which might work for someone else, I don't think it would work for sort of the audience that come to my Substack.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, another question here. I'm interested to hear what reporting is available on Substack. Please, can you tell us what analytics are offered to help Substackers work out what content works and what doesn't?
Yeah, so you have a dashboard, and on the dashboard, every single post or column or newsletter, whatever you want to call it, or podcast, you have analytics for each one. So it shows you where your audience came from. So did they come direct? Did they come through Twitter or Instagram? Because remember, you end up using your Instagram and Twitter as a sort of marketing tool. One of the things I always say to writers is make sure your Substack is at the top of your bio, and say very clearly, you will find all my writing on Substack. Every time I put a column out, I put it on Instagram, but I go, come on over and join the conversation over on my Substack. So you're constantly pulling people over. So that's why on the analytics, you'll see where they've come from. You see the open rate. You see how many paid people you got as a result, how many free subscribers you got as a result, how many times it was shared. So the analytics are pretty good. But remember, they're also changing all the time. The interesting thing about it as a platform is readers are still having the opportunity to inform what this platform is. You know, we have a thing called office hours every Thursday. I'm on there, the CEO is on there, and people can just write in their questions and say, what do I, you know, can you do this? What do you do? You've still got the CEO answering some of those questions. So it's a good time to sort of grow with the platform, I suppose, is one thing.
That's quite new in the UK. Yeah. So, I mean, what's been the response from, if you know, from magazines and from editors and freelancers? I think we asked it at the beginning, but almost directly, how's the UK responding to Substack? What's the kind of take up? So in the beginning, it was so obviously the sort of my job for the first few months is getting people to understand what it is. In the last, I would say, 2 months, the people now in certain worlds, by the way, seem to get what it is. And if I'm honest, I can't really keep up with the demand. The growth is like that. So, you know, today I've just got back to back conversations with big writers who will want to get on there. So you've got now, which is why I say to people, get on the bloody thing now. It's the early time. You have writers now going, hang on a minute. You know, how can I protect my future and still write for mags, because I love writing for magazines. So people now, and it's a noticeable change, are getting on the platform in their droves. We're still at that interesting point where social media in the early days, I don't know if you remember, I think it was on Instagram, but it was like a follow Friday. You know, those, and blogging was the same. In the early days, everybody that was on certain platforms felt like they were in it together and everybody was helping one another. Substack, we only brought this out last week, has just started a recommend. So if you say we're to start a Substack, Maria, it will ask you, who do you read? So you might put me, or you might put, I don't know, Dominic Cummings or whatever. You recommend them. They then will get a notification saying, Farrah, Maria has recommended you. Would you like to recommend her back? So you start to see this growth. It's writers helping writers. That's what happens in the early days of these things. You know, everybody's of the mindset, which is, let's just all grow together. And are you finding some sectors are more interested in that than others? I'm thinking, is it like specifically, as you say, kind of almost like a certain, I don't know, car magazines or psychology or beauty or education? Are you finding certain writers from those sectors are finding Substack more useful? Are there some that are joining it quicker than others? Yeah, so political writers, because it was founded political writers, that's why. So politics, I talk to any political writer, they know what it is, they're subscribers already, they get it. Finance writers, very huge growth there, huge, people making a lot of money because it's a service. Crypto newsletters, massive growth. Money. Huge. People talking about money. Right. And also people paying those sort of crypto newsletters, people are charging about $100 a month because they can do, because if people read one newsletter and they get a tip off, that's money well spent. But I tell you where my gut feeling is the opportunity is female centric. You know, there are women on Substack, of course, but I'd love to see more.
the whole lifestyle world, gardening, food is massive on Substack, but gardening, there's massive opportunities. Wellness, I still feel there's huge opportunities. Beauty, fashion, because the beauty and fashion world is on Instagram at the moment, because of course those people are interested in ads. But if you're not a huge influencer who's not getting a huge amount of money for, and those people are probably not going to come over to Substack just yet because they're still making a lot of money with ad deals. But then you've got those mid-tier people who are not making huge amounts of money but have amazing content. I would say now is the time to get on, because, you know, I edit Substack Reads, which is our sort of weekend supplement of the best writing on Substack. And even this week I was talking to my writer and I was saying, I wish there was more fashion to choose from. I wish there was more beauty. Those areas, definitely an opportunity there.
Great for the people listening, hopefully, that we've identified some opportunities. There's just one more question, which I think we've kind of answered with the recommends, but for people that are already using it and want to share the platform with others, do Substack offer an affiliate program? I think with the recommends, is that?
The recommends is probably the closest thing we have to an affiliate. Yeah, that's probably the closest thing.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Farrah. And now knowing that you're back to back, I feel very privileged that you spent the time with us.
You're welcome. No.
Thanks very much. I was expecting so many more questions from people, but actually I think we've covered so much today anyway. Thank you for your time, and thank you for organising this.
Thanks very much for having me. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye.